this video I want to take a dive into the system components in intelligent bots, which are the out-of-box building blocks for constructing a conversational dialogue flow. Thanks for watching. My name is Grant Ronald from the Oracle Mobile Platform team. Now, hopefully you will recall that in intelligent bots a dialogue flow is defined using a header, some variables and a number of different states. Now, each state represents a single step in the conversation and is implemented using a building block called a component. Each component contains the logic that's executed, such as getting input from the user, displaying a list of options to the user, or calling a back-end system. Now, if we look more closely at the components, we'll see that each component typically defines some properties, which are input arguments into the components, and actions, which allow the component to define how it navigates to different parts of the dialogue flow. Now, components come in two different flavors. There's system components and there's custom components. System components are those standard components provided out of the box by intelligent bots, and you can tell a system component because it's prefixed with system dot. These system components perform standard functionality in the dialogue flow, such as output for outputting text to a user, setting a variable, conditional navigation using a switch component, and most importantly a system.intent component for resolving the user's input to one of your intents. Custom components, on the other hand, are, as the name suggests, built by you to perform a specific and a custom action. Now, these custom components are implemented as REST services, and they generally sit outside of the bot platform. Now, you can deploy them on any system that supports REST services, although we recommend hosting them in Oracle Mobile Cloud Enterprise, since that's the platform which includes intelligent bots. Anyway, we'll cover that later in a later video. Now, the most common use case for custom components is to call a back-end system. For example, to actually retrieve the required bank balance from your banking system. The custom component would define any properties or parameters that it needs and would take care of calling the banking APIs which actually do the banking transaction. You might also use a custom component if you want to display some sort of specialized user interface, maybe some sort of fancy carousel of options rather than a text or a list. In which case, the custom component can return a reply back to the user using an appropriate markup, which the channel can then use to render an appropriately rich UI. And of course, anything else that the platform doesn't do out of the box, you can write a custom component to do. That might involve logging information about the conversation, or maybe passing the user off to a live agent. It's totally up to you. Okay, so now you know what dialogue components are. I'll take you through the current set of system components, describe what they do, and discuss how you might use them. Okay, we'll start with the intent system component, which is how we invoke the NLP engine from the dialogue flow to get inputs from the user and resolve it to one of our intents. Now, the component properties include the name of the variable, which is of type NLP result, and it's in this variable that the result of the intent resolution is placed. You also have a confidence threshold that intent results must exceed in order to be processed. And typically you'll see this component at the topmost state in the flow, because determining the user's intent is often going to be the very first thing that the bot tries to do. Navigation actions are based on the resolved intent, so if the input resolves to balances, then the conversation navigates to start balances. There's also a navigation option called unresolved intent, and this option is called when no intent could be determined with a confidence level above the value defined for the confidence threshold property. And this gives you a really nice, neat way of gracefully handling a failure, maybe sorry I didn't understand you, or do you want to speak to a human agent? Next we have the system.setVariable component. This component simply takes a value, in this case the literal string savings, and places it in the named variable. Now, in this case I'm using a literal string as the value, however you could refer to another variable or the value of a resolved entity. And we'll talk about referencing variable values in another video. The output system component simply sends text output to the communication channel. The text property is the text to be sent, and this may be programmatic using value expressions, or in this case it's just a literal string. Keep turn indicates whether the dialogue flow will wait for the user input or not, and true indicating that the dialog flow will not accept user input. Next we're on to system.text. Again, it's a very simple component which you'd use if you want to get a specific piece of information maybe the user hasn't yet supplied. So you can prompt the user, get the user's input and into a variable. Now the max prompt property determines the number of attempts a user has to provide a valid value before the cancel action is called to transition, allowing you to have a graceful handling if the user's not entered correct data. The list component is used to present a choice of list to the user. Now the options are the choices that are presented to the user, and they can be comma delimited values, an entity value list, or any list gotten through a value expression. In this example, I'm using a value expression to reference the values of the account type entity. The list component also has an option max prompt property, and that has a cancel action, and this again is useful if the users don't select from the list but they type in the option themselves. The condition equals component is a bit like an if then else condition statement. The variable property is the name of the context variable that will be tested, and the value is the value that's going to be compared to the variable. If those two values are equivalent, then the equals transition action, in this case ask payment amount, will be utilised to navigate to a new state. Conversely, if they're not equal, then the not equals transition action will be utilised. The condition exists component simply checks whether a variable has been set or not. So the variable property is the context variable that will be tested, and the transition actions exist and not exist will be executed depending on whether the variable has been set or not, respectively. And this would be useful if you want to check to see if a value has been supplied before you go ahead and ask the user. Okay, we're halfway through. I think I need a cup of coffee, so hit pause and then we'll continue in a few seconds. Okay, we've got coffee ready to carry on. Right. Our next system component is the switch component. This is similar to a switch statement in Java, which allows you to define multiple branches depending on the value of a variable. The variable property is the variable that will be compared to the list of values in the values property. So if category is set to vehicle, then the switch statement will jump to get vehicle quote. If no match occurs, the component will look for a transition action called none. The OAuth account link component has to do with login security, and I'll briefly mention it here. So you might be chatting with your banking chatbot to find out branch opening times or the latest interest rate changes, but at some point you want to find out personal information such as a bank balance. You need to be authenticated. The bot's platform can be set up to accept an OAuth 2 authentication from an external provider, in which case the user will need to be redirected to the external identity provider's login page. Okay, we're in the home straight now. Are you keeping up? We're on to reset variables. Let's imagine the use case when maybe the user has decided to cancel whatever they've been doing, maybe ordering a pizza. It might make sense to reset all of the variables in the context. The reset variable component will simply reset to null all of the variables contained in the variable list property. Two more to go. Okay, our next system component is copy variables, which, as you might expect, is a quick way to copy one or more variable values. Maybe you have a pizza bot and you want to remember what the user ordered the last time. So you can copy the values from some context variables, maybe before the reset, and copy them to some user scope variables, which will be preserved even when the bot conversation is restarted. And here we are at the last component, and we save one of the best to last, and this is called system.matchEntity. What this component does is check to see if the value in a variable exists within a specified entity using the intent model. So user car is a string variable which holds, let's say, the type of car a user is interested in buying. Using this component, we can establish whether that value is a valid car when compared against car type entity, which is a variable which references a car entity. And there you go. That was a quick rundown of all of the out-of-the-box system components that Oracle Intelligent Bots gives you to help you build a rich chatbot conversation. Thank you very much for watching.